Voters' rights. Then I will start my time now. Congress was designed to deliberate, but today's America it delays. This isn't careful governance, it's systemic neglect. Undeniably, in recent years, Congress has been slower than ever. Steve Bannon from MSNBC News in 2025 writes that 118th Congress is the most gridlocked, ineffective Congress in American history. Fortunately, executive orders provide an escape from the unwavering clog in Congress. KCCI in 2025 finds that despite legislative shutdowns, executive orders create necessary actions to keep our government running. When Congress fails to pass meaningful legislation, presidents turn to executive orders, a much more sustainable approach to governance. Thus, Team 1193 affirms our sole argument is driving progress. Subpoint A is advancing justice. Advancing civil rights is not on Congress's agenda. Ariana Vergara, a reporter for the state's newsroom in 2024 writes, in the past year, Congress didn't pass a single civil rights legislation thanks to a divided and inefficient Congress that does not prioritize civil rights. Not only do they not care, they go as far as undermining the existing legislation. Caroline Frederickson, president of American Constitution Society, writes that congressional filibusters use strategies to thwart civil rights legislation for decades, which has prompted presidents to use executive orders to circumvent Congress. Indeed, executive orders do not wait on legislation. Look at Biden's term. Eugene Daniels on political fines. Biden's civil rights agenda did not wait on the sluggish Congress. Instead, he adopted a much more aggressive strategy using executive orders. In fact, LCHR in 2023 finds that Biden alone issued more than 50 executive orders with civil rights implications. And historically, executive orders have laid the foundation for a free America. Christopher Anders, the director of policy in 2025, explains Abraham Lincoln used an executive order, the Emancipation Proclamation, to free the slaves. FDR used an executive order to integrate shipyards. Truman signed an executive order to integrate the military. Lyndon Johnson used an executive order to impose civil rights obligations for all. And Biden used an executive order to require every federal agency to facilitate voter registration. These orders didn't just make statements, they changed history. TLI explains that Truman's executive orders set the course of civil rights for the rest of the century with the signing of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And even if there are bad executive orders, those are a fault of Congress. Legal scholar Elisa Wetzel explains that the reason there are bad executive orders is because the courts failed. These actions would happen anyway because the fact that Congress won't check them proves that they agree with them and it would have happened no matter what. Subpoint B is emergencies. Executive orders solve emergencies in two ways. First, through agencies. Executive orders have been crucial in the creation of many agencies. Harvard professor William Howell explains that presidents have created over 240 agencies using executive orders. For example, the Peace Corps, EPA, and FEMA. The continued use of executive orders is also critical to their function. Barbara Hellman in 2025 explains that executive orders direct agencies on how to interpret and enforce regulations or to prioritize certain actions. And these agencies have saved countless millions. Peace Corps in 2022 quantifies that Peace Corps in contribution with PEPFAR has saved more than 25 million lives. FEMA in 2017 explains that in just one hurricane, they saved 7 million lives. And finally, Week 17 quantifies that the EPA has helped reduce air pollution by 70%, saving millions of lives every single year. The second way is through pandemics. Biden used an executive order in response to COVID-19. Farrer of the University of Michigan wrote that Biden signed 10 executive orders to combat the pandemic, mandating masks, accelerating vaccination, and providing more funding. Executive orders are needed because the government couldn't act with the same urgency and coordination. And the impact of the vaccination from these orders were vital. The White House analyzed this year that over 270 million Americans received at least one shot of the vaccine, saving over 3 million lives and preventing over 18 million hospitalizations, and thus Team 1193 is so proud of you.
The case of rhetoric, plus attention. Oh, okay, I'll give you a second. emails end up in spam. So
Yeah, I can check this one.
yeah, might have ended up there.
He's been kind of slow right now.
Do both of y'all need the case, or is it okay?
Yeah,
Okay. So I'll just wait.
Okay, I think I just go.
All right.
I'm good.
Great. So if everyone is ready, my name is Alan. I'm speaking for 1271, and we are the con side of this thing. We negate the resolution resolved. On balance, in the United States, the benefits of the presidential executive orders outweigh the harms. Democracy is built on consent and not convenience. Executive orders replace deliberation with dictation and erode the foundation of the United States in two key ways. The first is instability. Every time the White House changes hands, the rulebook is rewritten overnight. Burg Act 25 says that orders are subject to immediate reversals from administration to administration. This leads to a pendulum swing in policy, sacrificing durability and legitimacy for speed. This volatility creates two crippling harms. The very first harm is the court system. Constantly changing orders invites numerous lawsuits. As Thompson 25 explains, in just the first few months of 2025, more than 100 separate cases were filed to block new orders, a surge that led the federal judiciary into uncharted territory. Well 25 furthers that presidents know that they can overwhelm the courts with outlandish executive orders and clog up the system. In the end, Joanno 15 of the University of North Carolina warns that caseloads get backlogged, access to justice is limited, clogs stretch out hearings on key constitutional issues, and affect the very civil rights the country is built upon. The second harm is economic uncertainty. Stratford 25 says that it warns that executives fear massive and rapid changes as each president signs directives that the very next can erase, making long-term planning difficult. This makes firms shelve their expansion plans as they don't know what to expect in the future. The damage is clear. Rosin 24 finds that regulatory instability has triggered losses of $1.7 trillion in the span of 2 years, while Baker 25 figures that increases in uncertainty cut gross investment by 6% and decreased GDP. While Glenn 20 of Harvard quantifies just a single order on immigration policy wiped $100 billion off the Fortune 500 in the matter of just 10 days. The second argument is a bad executive. Executive orders were meant to manage the bureaucracy, and they now function as a legislative bypass. Francis 25 notes that because orders require no congressional vote, a single signature can rewrite national policy, turning separation of powers into a revolving door of one-man rule. This unilateral shortcut is no longer the exception, it is the norm. Medal 25 finds that modern presidents average 40 to 80 orders a year, and Gomez 25 finds that Trump shattered nearly every historical record by signing 142 orders in his first 100 days. The result is a permanent arms race in which each administration issues even more decrees simply to keep pace. Formal checks cannot keep up, as Christensen 19 demonstrates that Congress and the courts rarely overturn these directives, and public opinion offers little deterrent. As a result, political scientists are alarmed. Levitsky 18 argues that America's Constitution is largely silent on the limits of unilateral executive action, making it thin tissue easily torn by an autocratic leader that can come along at any time. In fact, Row 24 and the Center for American Progress in 25 find that presidents across parties, emboldened by crisis rhetoric post 9/11, have expanded executive powers while maintaining secrecy, moving the country toward authoritarianism. There are two impacts. The first is serial policy failure. When executive orders are enacted, they replace long-term congressional actions. HUD 25 explains that Congress refrains from taking the wheel on issues that the president takes the burden on. In Hughes 25 burgers, that presidents end up pouring time into orders rather than actually working with Congress to create policies. This rushed policymaking leads to disastrous outcomes, as Potter 17 does an analysis of 11,000 orders and finds that they reduce regulatory quality of government agencies and lead to value-time decisions. Devastatingly, Chem 22 does a study and finds that more executive actions raise the death toll during times of crisis. The second impact is worldwide harm. Overstretch of orders has wreaked havoc on policy, as historically, Reuters 25 finds that in the form of tariffs, it cost the world economy $34 billion, while Colossi 25 finds that U.S. aid cuts through executive orders are killing an adult every 3 minutes in this round, a child every 31. It's for those reasons we strongly hate. Are we good for crossfire?
Yes.
All right, sounds good.
Actually,
Oh yeah, I'll take a second to drink some water as well.
So if you've seen executive orders for over 250 years, why haven't this court clog caused by executive orders caused our democracy to shift to authority?
Yeah, so we tell you something unique is happening right now. What is happening right now is that presidents now know that they can use orders and essentially overwhelm the court system. That's why Thompson 25 evidence is unique to the current scenario in the context of what's happening, and finds out right now executive orders are essentially clogging up the courts. They're limiting access to justice right now for people who need their cases heard.
Can I have a follow-up?
Okay, sure.
Are you highlighting a trend, or are you picking one presidency in which court?
This is a trend, right? This is happening right now.
Wait, how is this a trend if you're highlighting 1 year that we've seen that presidents do this rather than 14,000 other executive orders that should have caused the courts?
Executive orders are excessively litigated, right? That is a trend that we've been seeing, not just over the past 1 year, right? Over the past 2 decades, we've been seeing more and more executive orders litigated as presidents are overstepping their role.
So if that
I
is
have a question, though.
Yeah, we can get back to this.
All right, let's talk about the COVID response, right? So you claim that executive orders were really effective for the COVID response,
Yes.
right? So when did Biden sign those executive orders?
Pretty soon.
It was 2021, right?
Okay.
According to your own evidence, right?
Yeah.
And when did the COVID pandemic start?
2020.
Great. So what happened in 2020 then? Why was the action a year later and not in 2020?
Oh yeah, so basically what happened is Congress passed the CARES Act. Basically what the CARES Act did is it funded the development of vaccines. It takes time for vaccines to be created. It takes a couple months. That's why Biden's executive, if you let me finish please. That's why executive orders weren't enacted immediately. So when the vaccines were done being created, that's when Biden's executive orders happened, and they were able to distribute the vaccinations to 270 million.
We would say that's a misrepresentation of history, right? You look at what actually happened. What happened in March of 2020 at the start of the pandemic, executive orders were not used to develop vaccines, right? That was all congressional action, as you just said. What executive orders did do was start to withdraw the United States from the World Health Organization. Were used to do things like actually limit, vaccine development, right? Whereas
Okay, if
all
all
of
of that is true, then you must ask yourself why Congress didn't pass any legislation to distribute the vaccines. All they did was create the vaccines, but if all the vaccines stay with the government, stay with the companies, how does that help the American people, and how does that solve COVID? The answer is executive orders
so
are
you're
the
saying
only
that
way to solve,
you're
to
saying that
distribute the
in order
vaccines
for
to the
companies
people.
to sell a vaccine, like to give someone a vaccine, they need
Well, yeah,
authorization
just
from
think
Congress.
about Big Pharma. They're not going to just willingly give
So
vaccines.
every single drug approval you're saying is happening through Congress, not like the FDA.
If you let me finish, please.
Yeah,
If you're just thinking like big pharma, they aren't like they just want to make money as quickly as possible. But what Biden was able to do, it was able to effectively redistribute all the vaccinations to the American people, helping 270 million people. That's what our evidence tells you.
I think that's a fundamental misunderstanding of what happened during the COVID pandemic and how
That's
democracy works.
that's facts, and that's what our evidence
You
says.
can, would you like the question?
Yes, let's go back to the court clock. You said that's been happening for the past 2 decades. Why have we not turned authoritarianism in the past 2 decades?
We tell you that right now, for the past 2 decades, presidents have been overstepping their authority.
You talk about 1 year,
But that's
instead of
wrong.
highlighting 250 years.
You better cook.
The order is just going to go top down. This is Rodolph Ganesh speaking second for code 1193. Is everyone ready? Starting time now. One example does not prove a trend. The resolution is asking, do the benefits of executive orders outweigh the harms? Not do the benefits of Trump's executive orders outweigh the harms? Their evidence is only analyzing one singular administration, and it is trying to say out of this administration that 250 years worth of executive orders is bad. But our argument is that if you look to history, executive orders have saved 25 million people, and you cannot negate based on the fact that there are glimpses of authoritarianism like they tell you in their case. But first, let's start on their argument on instability. Our opponents argue that executive orders create a pendulum swing, but this isn't true. A 100-year-long meta-analysis from Kenneth Lalonde of the University of Michigan in 2023 finds that 74% of executive orders remain in effect and aren't revoked, unlike they tell you, which means that this uncertainty created is not due to executive orders. But specifically, on their first reason of court clock. Court clock has been a problem for 50 years, yet nothing has happened. Where 12 finds that cries of alarm have sounded for half a century. In 2012, the ABA warned that underfunding was a threat hanging over the 90s. It was crowded dockets. meaning that this court clog has been a problem for such a long time, yet we've never seen the US revert to authoritarianism, so you're not going to see their impacts happen. Then they say that executive orders hurt democracy, but our Princeton study shows that Congress does not care about the people. It's a 20-year meta-analysis and shows that the wills of the people have no effect on the legislation of Congress, which is why our University of Chicago study that's analyzing 64 years of data tell you that executive orders do actually reflect the will of the people. So when we look to a world without executive orders, we see our democracy eroding even more. But on economic uncertainty, one, investors are already used to the pendulum. It will not swing anymore. Crosstalk 25 finds that after a twist of U.S. trade policy, stock investors are more resilient to the developments and the shifting in policies, which means their impacts will not happen and have not happened throughout history. But two, this issue isn't unique to executive orders. Jared Ortelize of UCLA finds that the Affordable Care Act, for instance, had many modifications leading to investors to be uncertain, meaning that legislation in general, not just executive orders, causes their impacts. It's not specific. Let's go to their second argument about bad executive. First, they say Congress can't keep up with the checks, but the courts can, and they are currently. There are numerous injunctions against Trump's executive orders proving that EOs have effective checks. Congress.gov in 2025 writes that there were 86 nationwide injunctions placed against the Trump administration. Keitner 25 finds that there were over 186 legal action taken against Trump executive orders, and Knudsen 25 finds that the courts checked 96% of all executive orders created by Trump, meaning that all of these checks are working and the Congress is keeping up. Then, let's go to their two impacts. First, on policy failure. They say Congress spends less time making legislation because they're so focused on making legislation for executive orders. That's inherently not true. They are only analyzing the bills that Congress has passed, but EHT 25 finds that Congress has introduced 16,000 bills, yet only 100 were actually passed. What does this mean? It shows that Congress is trying and does have the time to actually try to make these bills pass, but the reason why they are disagreeing is because they are ideologically divided, which means you have to vote for executive orders to go against them. Then, on their impacts, one, they talk about tariffs, but Wisner 2025 finds that multiple courts have permanent injunctions against Trump tariffs on May 28th, which is why they changed the recession when USA dropped to 30%. On USAID, we would argue that executive orders created USAID in the first place because Ingram of Brookings explains that executive orders issued by Kennedy established USAID, and that's really good because USAID has saved 91 million lives according to Beatrice from just last month. Even thus, we affirm.
Really quickly,
Yeah.
so can I get the EHT evidence, the injunction, the 86 subpoenas, and the instruction of Congress?
You said continuation of Congress?
Oh yeah, so up to 86. What was the other one?
I sent Princeton Yushin Garber, you sent one more.
Oh yeah. Okay, it should be sent.
How many emails do you have?
3.
executive orders prove that they only do more harm than good, it's really easy to negate. The most important argument for this round is our argument about the bad executive. What we tell you is that time and time again, because these policies are rushed, don't consult experts, and don't actually accomplish anything for the public, they've resulted in bad regulatory conditions that have only worsened problems. But let's take a look at their responses. They all fall flat. First, they tell you that courts are going to check back on these policies. But first, the injunctions that they talk about are only very temporary pauses. But Howell analyzes the actual results of these court cases and finds that in the long term, 83% of them side with the president rather than what's actually constitutional. But then, even if you believe that they are checking the unconstitutional executive orders, our argument is that even if the orders are constitutional, they still do harm to the public, i.e., aid cuts were still constitutional, yet they still killed hundreds of thousands of people. Then, they tell you that Congress is still effective. That's our whole argument. Congress is effective, executive orders are not, and they get in the way. Finally, they say that executive orders will establish the agencies, but they're just wrong. The OIG finds that the reason the U.S. aid was even created in the first place was because of legislation and the Foreign Assistance Act passed in 1961 that created all of the funding and essentially created and mandated the agency. But then, let's go to their case. There's a lot of problems here. First, at the top, they paint a narrative of gridlock, but the reality is far different. As the professors at Vanderbilt University in 2025 analyzed 15 different metrics over 50 years and finds that Congress is not gridlocked. Despite perceptions of polarization, they have still been able to pass policy on key areas like immigration, like energy investment, and like tax relief, which their own EHT evidence concedes. Even then, Allen 14 finds that executive orders don't actually bypass this gridlock. He studies 50 years of policy and finds that executive orders are rarely used to put in policy that wouldn't have passed in Congress, meaning that in the long run, they only do what presidents want, not what the public wants. But then, let's go to their specific arguments. Start on their argument about civil rights. They claim that Congress hasn't done anything and they're falling behind on civil rights. But they ignore the fact that just within the past couple years, we've seen renewals of landmark bills for things like women's rights, for things like labor rights. All of these have happened. Their evidence just cherry picks one bill that was stalemated in Congress and doesn't actually look at the full picture. Whereas if you look at executive orders, it's proven that they don't actually help civil rights. Hinckley in 2023 does an analysis of executive orders and finds that only 3.8% of them actually do anything to address civil rights in a positive manner. And at that point, we would tell you, look at the 97% of executive orders that have only harmed the public and harmed civil rights. Look to history. Anders 25 explains that the government's worst actions, things like Trump's rescinding of Johnson's civil rights protections, the Manhattan Project, keeping Guantanamo Bay open, and banning Muslim travel, all happened through executive orders. We contend that this is uniquely bad because executive orders can be lawful, as Anders furthers that as long as when an executive order is passed, these civil rights violations become lawful under the law, only worsening the problems that they talk about. But then, let's go to their argument on crisis response. First, on agency creation, Constitution Annotated explains that Congress has the authority to make these agencies in the first place. It's why their own PEPFAR example of saving millions of lives was actually legislation, not an executive order. Then on pandemics, realized that Congress acted faster. Pearson Foundation found that they passed 6 bills within the first year before Biden's first executive order. Even then, executive orders have derailed long-term health response. Deng explains that executive orders have destroyed funding for agencies like the CDC and destroyed research funding. And moreover, Cohen finds that they destroyed virus funding, which means that every single future pandemic becomes harder to respond to because it's taken out the undergirding health infrastructure that is key to solving back for them.
Okay. We need a few cards.
Yeah.
First, can you send me 3.8%?
Yep.
And then, when you said the evidence that says Congress had renewed a bunch of women's rights bills.
On your side, you mentioned like 83% evidence. You said that.
Okay, so the first one you wanted was 3%, right?
Yeah, 3.8.
The 3.8%, Congress passed bills, and the 83%.
2017.
Okay.
Also,
Yeah, we got the 340.
Did you say you just hit the 83? We're just waiting on 84%. Like, I think we can.
Wait, what's the limit?
Starting time. So let's look to your argument about the bad executive.
Yeah.
Can you explain like how you're
Yeah, so what we tell you is that the ability to pass executive orders means that the policies the president passed don't actually go through any sort of formal review. What that means is that empirically what we've seen is that the regulations and the legislation that this has produced has often resulted in more harm than good. Let's just look at COVID, for example. Trump banned vaccine mandates in schools, which only made the pandemic worse. If you look to like past examples, Nixon's price controls drove up inflation by 37%. Our Potter evidence does the analysis for you. It looks at 11,000 different regulations that these executive orders have produced and finds that on the whole, they are beneficial for the public, they worsen progress. Can I take a question now? Yeah. So let's go to sort of your examples on let's talk about like agency creation, right? So given that Congress is the one who always has historically, even in the examples that you talk about, like USAID and PEPFAR, they've been the ones who have advanced the legislation to create the funding and thus create the mandate for the agency. Why is executive orders uniquely
So
key?
I'm glad you asked that. So if we look to the EPA, for example, we saw Congress pass the Clean Air and Water Act, but the fact of the matter is, when they passed it in 1970, it was not effective because it delegated all the rights to the states, and what the states did, they only actually needed voluntary action, and they created a bunch of small little federal agencies that were never effective. What the EPA did and what President Nixon did was he reinstated the EPA, which coordinated all of those agencies, and that's when we saw pollution. But real quick, on your USAID order, for the USAID example 2, when Congress passed that legislation, again, USAID wasn't actually made. It just set up the plan, but that plan wasn't coordinated and it wasn't specific enough. Our argument is that Congress only passes this type of broad legislation that doesn't actually do anything, but when executive orders come in, they create this USAID, they create this actual USAID, which led to 91 million people being helped. But can I take a question?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, cool. Let's go to civil rights.
Yeah, for sure.
Can you name, okay, in 2023, 2024, and 2025, how many civil rights legislation was passed during Congress?
Yeah, so what we would tell you is that there were tons of massive bills that would advance civil rights.
No.
I.e., the examples that Alan just said you talk about, for example,
So-
Congress advancing women's rights in the
Okay,
workplace.
so we would argue that there was only 2 single civil rights legislation being passed, the
No.
anti-lynching and the one you sent.
Not
If you look to
necessarily.
our evidence, we say that they've introduced
Yeah.
all of those bills that you're talking about. They
That's-
haven't
no, no, no,
introduced,
no.
but they haven't
Here.
actually been passed because
Here's the problem.
they don't.
First, Congress renewed a bunch of civil rights bills. Alan can get, like, we can give you more examples
Renewals
if you feel
don't
like
mean
it.
anything. Those
Renewals
bills were
do
already.
mean anything.
Those bills were already.
Yeah, but
created, right?
they would have ended if they weren't renewed.
Yeah,
Those
that doesn't
protections
mean that they're
would have
making
remained.
new bills,
I know,
right?
like, wait, they still pass new bills.
Okay,
For
but
exa- like,
okay, that's fine.
like, either way, your evidence just says one bill was revoked, not that rule somewhere.
20 seconds to the rep. Start.
That wasn't a joke. Tab staff said that phones need to be off for the people who were spectating. We'll ask you later. We have to remind you again. Thanks. Folks with laptops open, please close them. Maybe this hasn't happened on your circuits, but it has happened on ours, where spectators with laptops were communicating with people. I don't think this is happening, but Caesar's life should be above reproach. It's better to have them closed so there's no accusations of any sort of misconduct.
We have 15 seconds. The thesis of our case is simple. When Congress refuses to act, executive orders become the force that moves America forward. They lose the round when they never respond to our 20-year Meta-Nostrum principle, which says that Congress does not care about what the people say. That is why another unresponsive piece of evidence, a 64-year Meta-Nostrum, the University of Chicago find that executive orders reflect the will of the people. Ask yourself, would you rather be living in a world in which executive orders exist and take in what the people want, or a world in which Congress rules without the people's input? It is obvious that executive orders are the only way to effectively govern the country. Now, let's go to the place we're going to be voting for us is on our argument about emergencies. First, on agencies, we tell you that executive orders is the only reason why agencies like the Peace Corps, EPA, and FEMA exist. At the end of their speech, they have not mentioned the words Peace Corps, EPA, or FEMA. They just mentioned PEPFAR. But the reason that PEPFAR was effective was because they worked in collaboration with a Peace Corps, which was created by an executive order and saved 25 million lives. At the end of the day, that in just one hurricane, FEMA saved 7 million lives, and the EPA has reduced air pollution by 70% and saves millions of lives every single year, all which goes unresponded to and is the biggest impact in this round. Now let's go to pandemics. They tried to tell you that 6 bills were passed before Biden's executive order. But they don't respond to our analysis that tells you, sure, all Congress did was they created funding to create the vaccinations. But after the few months after it took to create the vaccination, Biden's executive orders were pivotal in redistributing those vaccinations to the American people. Just think about it. All of the vaccinations were just centered at the top without the American people getting access to it. That's why, after Biden passed 10 executive orders, 270 million Americans had access to vaccinations, saving 3 million people, all of which was unresponsive to and is why executive orders have our clear benefits. But now let's go into their arguments. At the top, One example does not prove a trend. If you look to their impacts, they're analyzing all Trump's policies. They're cherry-picking one presidency and ignoring the other 14,000 executive orders. But when you look to history, you know they are wrong. Now let's go to their argument about a bad executive. Remember, their 83% evidence that they rule in favor of the president is from 2 decades ago. Our evidence is much more recent. It finds that with just looking to Trump, 96% of his executive orders were checked by the courts, with 86 injunctions filed against him. Basically, what these injunctions do is they prevent any of his policies from going through, so there were no harms of those executive orders. That is what they don't respond to. But also, remember that the EHG evidence that tells you that Congress is trying to pass legislation as if it introduced 16,000 bills, but the reason those bills haven't been passed is because Congress can't agree on what to do because they're so gridlocked, meaning that they have agreed that executive orders are the only path forward. Let's go to the USAID stuff. But they tried to say that USAID was created by Congress. That is not true. Our evidence is very clear that Kennedy's executive order created USAID, which made all Congress did was pass this broad blanket statement that basically created the framework for USAID, but the presidential executive order actually implemented, saving 91 million lives, another one of the biggest impacts in this round. Thus, it is clear that you can be voting for AFT.
Our case is simple. Executive orders sacrifice quality governance for short-term convenience, and fast policymaking is bad policymaking. The place we're voting on in this round is the bad executive argument, where Francis explained that orders are passed unilaterally without consultation and are increasing in volume. That has 2 impacts. The first is serial policy failure, where Potter 17 analyzes 11,000 orders over the decades and finds that they reduce regulatory quality and lead to valley-time decisions because they rely on rush judgment rather than actual expertise. With 1022 finding that executive orders cause increased deaths during crises. That's why Reuters reports that tariffs are costing $34 billion and aid cuts are killing an adult every 3 minutes in this round. They give you two main responses. The first is that courts issue injunctions. Realize injunctions are just pauses, which are rulings on cases that are temporary. That's why they can see what Sami tells you, where Hawa Free looks at decades in empirics and finds that 83% of the time courts side with the executive. Looks at the only empirics in this round. Even then, it doesn't respond to the nuance of our argument. We can concede that all the AFT's executive actions are constitutional. It is fundamentally still bad, however, because we tell you it is hasty policy that avoids expertise and just fulfills political agendas and increases the death toll. And then they say our evidence analyzes one administration, but if 11,000 executive orders isn't enough, I don't know what is. Finally, they said that executive orders establish U.S. aid. Remember, Sami says that OIG finds that it was legislation that appropriated the funding and created the mandate to have it. The EO was only performed it. Even then, at the point where EOs are dismantling all future aid right now, it hurts all future disasters, which outweighs. Here's the first way. The first is a prerequisite, where executive orders on their side do not matter on net if they are destined to fail in the long term, and proper policymaking to solve issues never happens, increasing death tolls during crises. But the second is on time frame. Our impacts are long-term breakdowns. They say they have historical precedent, but they can see that we do as well. We give you a laundry list where it costs the trillions in the economy, killed millions with cuts, and rolled back civil rights protections. Here's where you break the clash. Not once in the round do they read you a holistic study, but Potter 17 looks at 11,000 orders, finds they implement hasty policy. Even if you don't buy that, we are the only side of this round that is forward-looking, at the point where executive order is being used badly right now, it worsens every single emergency response in the long run. On their arguments about firstly gridlock, realize that Vanderbilt 25 and Allen 14 have conceded and look at 15 years of metrics and find executive orders don't bypass gridlock at all, but they push hasty policy and things are just being passed in bigger bills. In fact, they try to say that executive orders help democracy, but their study is A, terrible. It talks about public policy as a whole, not Congress, and B, the fact that the president can be elected without the popular vote just proves it doesn't affect the actual will of the public. But then on the agencies argument, they make this argument that all agencies are created by order, but they concede that Congress has the authority to create agencies. For example, PEPFAR, it was created by legislation, not orders. Their evidence about 240 agencies wasn't even about orders specifically. But finally, on pandemics, at the point where Dane explains that destroyed CDC funding has been destroyed by executive order, pandemic surveillance has been destroyed, every single future pandemic is now harder to respond to. It's why the Peterson Foundation find that actually acted during COVID at first was Congress. They passed 6 bills within the first year, within the first month of the pandemic. In fact, Congress is the one that created all the programs they talked about. It wasn't Congress.
Ready for cross?
Alright. Yeah, we're good.
Okay. And the first question.
Yeah, sure.
You guys talk about Trump's tariffs, right?
Yeah.
So what happened to that executive order?
Most of those are still in place. You're
No.
gonna say that the
There was
you're
a
gonna say
permanent
that the courts
injunction
blocked
placed
it.
against it by the higher courts, which means that they cannot be reversed.
Wait,
and they were
actually,
temporary.
let
Can you let us answer your
Yeah.
question?
So what actually happened was that a trade court at first said it was unconstitutional. It went to the appeals court, and the appeals court said, okay, we're actually going to ignore this decision for now. We'll roll out at a later time. So as of now, right now, the majority of Trump's tariffs are actually still
On
in
May
place.
28th, there was a permanent injunction
And guess
placed
what? The
against
appeals
it.
court
They
then
can
overturned
repeal a
that.
permanent injunction. It was placed
And you
against it.
can
Now there's
appeal
no
court
tariffs
decisions.
anymore.
That's
If the
how-
lower court makes a decision, even if it's permanent,
No,
the
this was-
upper,
okay,
that's
it was
not
from
the
the
court system
higher
works.
court,
The upper
but you
courts
can
can repeal it.
Either way, that still doesn't negate the fact that 11,000 executive orders that were checked still cause more harm.
Yes.
Okay, that's fine.
I mean, like the problem with that 11,000 study, you never cite the harms
We
of the
do.
specific
tell
executive
you
The
order.
kept evidence is never
Yes,
responded to in this round that finds that it increases death tolls during times of crises. That is never responded to and approved.
Wait,
Even
wait.
if you want to say there was action during times like COVID-19, our evidence is really specific. When these executive orders were implemented, it only worsened the pandemic because of things like banning vaccine mandates. in
Again,
schools,
all of your
cutting
examples are
CDC.
just from Trump cutting it.
No,
You have a single example from any other
evidence-
our
Carter
Carter
evidence
evidence looks at
holistic.
11,000 administrations.
Yeah,
If you
but-
want more
For 11,000
examples,
words.
like
Okay,
Nixon,
yeah, if you-
increase.
Alright, but can we have a question?
Yeah, sure.
Alright. So let's talk about this argument on gridlock, right? So if you think Congress being historically the first to act in emergencies, how come there's no reference?
Okay, I think the part that you're missing on our pandemics argument is that all Congress did was they just funded the creation of vaccines. So sure, Congress created the vaccines, but that doesn't matter if the people don't get the vaccines. The only way that the people got the vaccines was through Biden's 10 executive orders, which helped 270 million people get the vaccines. That's what you've never
Here's
responded
the
to. You're just
problem.
focusing on Trump.
Here's the problem. Your 270 million evidence doesn't say it was because of the executive order. It just says that 270 million people got vaccinated.
Yeah.
That's really important because our Peterson Foundation evidence is pretty good on this question. There were 6 bills, not just including things like vaccine creation, but also formulas for distribution, funding the actual production of these vaccines and the so that they could be free for the public. That was what Congress
Wait,
did. Executive orders acted a year after the start of the pandemic, and on
Yeah.
top of that, volatile pandemic policy
Okay.
literally prolonged the pandemic as per our
we agree that Congress funded the production of these vaccines. But if you have vaccines and you cannot give them to the people, those vaccines are useless.
Yeah, but
Our
Congress-
argument is that Biden's executive order was the one that actually gave them to the people. So it doesn't matter
Except
how
that's
much
just-
funding Congress
except
gave
that's
to
just not what your
the production
evidence
of the
says. Your evidence
vaccination.
just says
It doesn't matter.
270
That's why, like,
people
you
got
have it, like,
Yeah,
vaccinated.
all your
Entire
evidence says
round.
it's 270 million
Yeah,
people
but
got
that's the
vaccinated.
entire round.
It
You
has
haven't
no
had
connection.
evidence
It
saying
never
that
once
any
mentioned
of the
executive
congressional
orders.
legislation
Right,
actually
that's
distributed
fine.
vaccines. We have 15 seconds.
The order is going to go in the affirmative and then is everyone good? Yeah. Alright. Starting time now. They lose the round when you don't hear a single mention of our Princeton or UChicago study. In summary, what does it tell you? It says that when you look at Congress in a world without executive orders, they do not care about the wishes of the people. They do what they want. But a 64-year meta-analysis shows that executive orders reflects the will of the people and they actually provide benefits. All of that goes absolutely unresponded to. But where you're voting for us is on our contention of emergency. We tell you executive orders have created Peace Corps, EPA, and FEMA, all of which go unresponded to, which have reduced pollution by 70% and have saved 25 million people. All they tell you is PEPFAR was created by legislation. One, that is a single executive order, but two, we would argue that the only reason PEPFAR was effective was because it worked with the Peace Corps to save the 25 million people. Again, unresponded to. On emergencies, none of their evidence says that Congress actually distributed the vaccines to people. Our argument is that Biden's executive order distributed the vaccines to 270 million people, which is why we saw 3 million lives saved. That is not what you see on their side. But speaking of their side, let's go there. They keep saying 11,000, but notice how the only actual examples they have is from the Trump administration. They are only analyzing the Trump administration, which is not the scope of this resolution. Our argument is telling you that if you look past the Trump administration, there have been actual benefits. But even if you want to look at the Trump administration, we tell you that the courts have checked 96% of all of his executive orders and that there were 186 injunctions placed. If you look to the terrorist one or if you look to DEI, all of them have had injunctions blocking them, showing that there are checks and balances. On the impact level, if you look to the USAID, they have not contested that USAID was created by an executive order which saved 91 million people. All of their impacts are hypotheticals, but you have seen 25 million people being saved. You've not seen this authoritarian regime or whatever that they talk about, but you have seen these people being saved, and that is why you are voting on the affirmative.
All right, we have 45 seconds.
Executive orders sacrifice quality governance for short-term convenience, which is why Francis 25 explains that are passed unilaterally without consultation. It has two key impacts. The first is our Plotter 17 evidence. It analyzes 11,000 orders outside of the Trump administration and finds that they've historically reduced regulatory quality, which is why the Kemp 22 evidence, which is never responded to in this round, finds that executive orders overall have increased deaths during times of crisis. But then, they've also conceded both our examples, first from Reuters, about how EO-imposed tariffs already cost the world $34 billion, and how aid cuts are killing one adult every 3 minutes. They just try to tell you that courts have checked these orders, but they've conceded all the analysis we've given you. First, these injunctions were all temporary, which is why Howell finds that in the long term, 83% of them get overturned and they side with the president. But even then, they've conceded that even if these orders are constitutional, they can still be bad for policy, which is why historically they've destroyed pandemic response and destroyed long-term regulation. Finally, they talk about how executive orders established USAID, but the OIG evidence is clear. It was legislation that appropriated the funding and created the actual plan for creating USAID. The executive order was merely performative. At the end of the day, executive orders don't matter if on net they're designed to fail in the long term. But let's go to their case. On the argument about democracy, remember, the Vanderbilt 25 evidence is conceded. 15 empirics over 50 years show that Congress is able to act in really swiftly on important policy areas. You prefer that over their study, which just looks at random surveys and isn't even about Congress specifically. But let's go to their arguments on crisis response. Remember, Congress is the one that has the authority to create agencies, which is why their evidence about 240 agencies doesn't mention executive orders specifically. FEMA, USAID, and PEPFAR were all mandates of Congress. Then on pandemics, they have fully conceded the dang evidence that executive orders are what destroyed CDC funding, pandemic surveillance, and research. That means that every future pandemic got infinitely worse because we didn't have the health infrastructure to actually create vaccines. It's game over there.